my name's Fila Townsend. It's a pleasure to be here for this conversation. I am a PhD candidate at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, and who will be joining us is Todd Wolfson and Chenjerai Kumanyika. I will say briefly who I am, but then I'll jump in and share a little bit about Todd and Chenjerai and really lead us into the discussion. But thank you so much for all of you guys joining us. I know we're excited for this conversation. As I mentioned, just briefly, I am a PhD candidate here at Rutgers. My work really touches on several areas. Primarily, I look at issues at the intersection of technology and workers, how technology is impacting work today, but particularly how it's impacting workers. And I think we'll even talk about why that's an important distinction in the flow of this conversation. I also do policy work. I'm affiliated with a think tank called Next 100, where I look at those issues. And as with everything that I do in my work, it's really thinking about issues around racial justice and equity. So really pleased to be having this discussion. Again, this is like the first time I'm doing something like this with Todd and Chenjerai, so I'm really excited. So briefly on the two of them. Really honored to have them. Chenjerai Kumanyika is a researcher, journalist, and an organizer. He works as assistant professor at Rutgers in the university or the Department of Journalism and Media Studies. His research and teaching focuses on the intersections of social justice and emerging media and culture and creative industries. He has written about these issues in journals such as Popular Music and Society, Popular Communication, the Routledge Companion to Advertising and Promotional Culture and Technology, and Pedagogy and Education. Dr. Kumanyika is also the collaborator for Seen on Radio Season 2, Seeing White. I definitely recommend you guys check out that, as well as the other podcast he's affiliated with. Season 4 looks at the history of American democracy. He's also the co-executive producer and co-host of Uncivil. This is Gimlet Media's Peabody Award-winning podcast on the Civil War. He's also been a contributor to the Intercept, Seen on Radio, as I mentioned, Transom, NPR Code Switch, All Things Considered, Invisibilia, and Vice. He's also a news analyst for Rising Up Radio. As an organizer, Chenjerai is on the executive committee of 215 People's Alliance and a member of Philadelphia Debt Collective, an affiliate of the Media Inequality and Change Center. It's a partnership between the University of Pennsylvania and Rutgers, and he continues to serve on Street Poets Board as well as the Moth Board. Todd Wolfson is the associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers University. Todd is trained as an anthropologist, and his research focuses on the convergence of technology, inequality, and social change. Todd has published 2 books, Digital Rebellion and the Birth of the Cyber Left in 2004, and The Great Refusal, Herbert Marcuse and Contemporary Social Movements, that was in 2017. He's currently working on a book. I just saw him tweet about this recently. It's focused on new forms of organizing and the gig economy. Todd is also the president of our very own Rutgers AAUP AFT union, representing about 8,000 people at Rutgers University. I'm also a proud member along with Chenjerai, and he's actually the co-director of the MIC Center that I mentioned earlier, the Media Inequality and Chance Center. So excited to have both of these distinguished guys here. And I just want to make a quick note. All of you attendees are placed on mute for the duration of the discussion. If you have questions, and we really encourage you to offer questions, please send them via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, just throughout the presentation as you send us questions, because we'll be eager to delve into them as we get to the latter part of the discussion, and we want to make sure we save time for your questions. So we're going to try to get to as many as possible. With that, I just want to say, again, thank you guys so much for joining us. Now, let's jump in. So today, I don't think this event would be appropriate if we didn't acknowledge the importance of today. As many as of you may already know, this marks the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. We know that in the aftermath of that, it sort of sent not just the country, but the world, right, into this, I think, major racial and social justice reckoning. And we can talk about even what it means, whether there is really a reckoning and who really is dealing with the reckoning. I'm excited to talk about that. But I want to just start with Chenjerai. What does it mean for you, right, as you're talking on this panel today, given the topic that we're going to be addressing? What does the anniversary mean to you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you for this incredible introduction, Fila. Thank you to the Rutgers Foundation and for inviting us. Really excited to be here and have a place to talk about this, especially with these folks. And I just got to say, y'all, one of the reasons I came to Rutgers was because it was a chance to think, research, and struggle deeply with scholars who I respect. And you got two of those scholars on this call right here in the form of Fila, who is really doing incredible work that's right on this topic, and Todd, my colleague Todd, who I've learned so much from on both scholarship and organizing and teaching. And I think it's important, by the way, that we have this forum. I just want to recognize this because so many of these conversations, which require a degree of precision and care and slow thinking, are actually playing out right now in our popular media, right, in social media and things like this, where we actually don't have the conditions that we need to actually say what needs to be said, to slow down, to think, to focus on nuance, and to focus on solutions, to be compassionate to each other, and all those kinds of things that need to happen. So I'm glad we have a space where we can do this. Now, to answer your question, Phila, I just want to say that, again, recognizing the murder, we can call George Floyd's killing a murder now legally, by George Floyd, by Derek Chauvin, and thinking about all the other sort of killings of people, extrajudicial killings, as the Malcolm X Grassroots Project calls it, and we think about the uprisings, that happened in result to this. And one thing I just want to focus on is, like, when you think about the uprisings that were happening a year ago, I mean, there were uprisings in over 2,000 cities across the world, right? Not even just simply in the United States. And I think that the question I want to really invite us to think through, because with the urgency and immediacy of these kinds of situations where police are killing people, people are in the street, all these kinds of urgent, acute forms of oppression, often that urgency kind of chokes actually our ability to imagine the kind of transformative future and power that we need at this moment. We start to simply ask questions which are understandable, like, well, how can we do policing without killing people? Like, that's a question a lot of people are asking. Or, why are, African Americans and other people so mad? Why don't they just, kind of follow the rules? And there might even be questions about what kinds of struggle, what forms of struggle constitute valid forms of struggle for social justice, for racial empowerment, for racial equality, for gender equality, queer equality, equality around disability. All those kinds of questions might emerge. And I just want us to think about those questions rather than simply those short-term kind of urgent questions, for us to ask a bigger question, which is this: what is the revolutionary tradition of actually addressing these conditions, right? And how must we, as a Rutgers community with so many resources and so many folks who are ready to learn, how can we align with that tradition most powerfully? Right? What is the tradition that has brought us to this point where I, as an African American professor, can be talking to you in this space, right? What other traditions may have tried to look like that revolutionary tradition, right? But actually were in some ways working against it. And this is a crucial thing we're going to talk about today, to kind of unpack and untangle, because everyone who, one of the things, when you have a massive racial uprising, it positions a lot of actors to pretend or to perform as though they're in alignment with it. And not everyone actually is. And that might include even people like George, our political officials who are at this moment meeting with the George Floyd family, right? So we're going to give us some critical tools to think through this. A couple of quick words before I just turn it back. One thing I want to offer into this conversation, we can talk more in the Q&A. I was first really, I think my thinking about this transitioned to a new level when I started thinking about, when I sort of witnessed the killing of, or didn't witness, but saw the response to the killing of Mike Brown in August 9th. And, you know, I remember I was a professor at that point, and someone said to me, you know, it's interesting that we, at that moment, I was at a conference in North Carolina. And it was interesting to me that someone said, you know, it's funny, we're here as professors, people who actually could afford to pay bail, who could afford a little bit more leeway in terms of our lives not being as vulnerable. We're here in a conference, in an air-conditioned conference in a hotel, and the people who are on the front lines, right, witnessing what's on the screen behind us, enduring those tear gas, right, they're actually people who can't really afford that kind of thing. They're some of the most vulnerable people in our society, right? And so I asked, actually, you know, my wife and I decided to go to Ferguson, and we went and we spent time. We went to Mike Brown's funeral, and we spent time sort of live streaming and sort of offering an account there and trying to be supportive of the movement. I just want to point out that at the point when folks are uprising and a lot of people are complaining about whether rioting is sort of, you know, what's called rioting is sort of a legitimate political tactic or not, one of the things that often happens is we don't go back and realize that those people were ahead of the curve, because when the federal task force came to Ferguson, what they revealed was a deep underlying structural condition. And so really quickly, I just want to move forward because we have a lot of important stuff to talk about, but I just want to say that we have a tradition in this country of thinking about these problems in a way that I think is unproductive and hurts our ability, right? Because we primarily focus on the personal. That's the dominant framework for understanding issues of racial justice and empowerment in this country, right? We focus on people's personal experience. So we might think about the attitudes of Derek Chauvin. How did Derek Chauvin become racist, right? We might also focus from a more conservative standpoint on the personal attitudes of George Floyd. Why didn't George Floyd just listen? Why did George Floyd have a substance abuse problem, right? But that deeply personal way of looking at things does play a role, right? Our psychology and our attitudes absolutely plays a role. But when you cut it off from the larger context, it then becomes, I think, something that is deceptive and actually counter-revolutionary and works against our other efforts. Because there's other levels. Every person also exists in a culture. There's a culture of policing in this country, right? There's a culture of corporate culture, right? Of organization, of how we look at things. University might be influenced, for example, by the corporate culture, right? And this matters when we think about racial empowerment, because you can have a person who fashions themselves, even a police officer or a university administrator or a manager at you know, Amazon or some other company or Uber or Lyft, and they could be like, we imagine ourselves individually as anti-racist, but what culture are you coming into? What are the shared practices and symbols and education actually that you're trafficking together? Because that winds up shaping that person's personal attitudes in a way, right? And then there's another level even beyond because we do sometimes talk about the culture, and often, and I really want y'all to pay attention to this, what we do is we conflate culture with something deeper, which is the structure that we're in, right? The structure, right? What is the underlying economics incentives? What are the laws that have happened? And so it's not so much just about the culture of the Minneapolis Police Department, but also what was the Minneapolis Police Department created to do historically? What was it created to do politically, and how has it functioned? And by the way, for those that are interested on this anniversary, to recognize that question, I mean, to really investigate that question, there is a group called the MPD 150 who has put together a 150-year history of the Minneapolis Police Department. And I would encourage you to review that document, form your own critical analysis of it, but it reveals a lot that shows you how impoverished our current conversation about racial justice is in that context. So as we think through fighting for the common good, racial justice, right, both at looking at specific issue around police and also the broader institutions, this personal, cultural, and structural analysis can actually help us to get to some deeper questions and push past some of the deception. And I'm going to close, but I just want to say that you know, two things I would have you look at is, rather than simply look at how we can train police, who, by the way, begged and defied their mayor to receive a warrior training, right? If we get to the structural level, we then will get into issues of funding. What is being funded by police and what is being defunded via the presence of police, right? Is an important question. But also, and this gets deeper, we then start to have to look at other areas, because every sort of, when you look at almost every issue of Black rebellion and uprising in history in America that helped to push us to the point we're in now, often police were the spark, as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has pointed out, but there were deeper issues of labor, there were deeper issues of housing displacement, there were deeper issues of people having their children removed and not being able to control their lives and experiencing racial terror. All those things are sort of like this cauldron that's already boiling. And then when the police comes at the sort of tip of the spear of that winds up setting off what is characterized as riots, but were ultimately rebellions against structural conditions. Now that's an analysis that then forces us to look at other areas, like, and I just want to say, in the life of George Floyd during the pandemic was someone who had lost his job during the pandemic. He was trying to recover and trying to restore himself, from a substance abuse problem, and he was working. This is a person who's trying to work. Whether he was trying to work or not, he doesn't deserve to be killed by the police. Let's be crystal clear by that. But I'm saying, if you want to understand how this individual was really brought to this point, if you really want to have understanding and not simply reaction, we got to look at that structural condition. And we got to ask what Ruth Wilson Gilmore asked. Why was a police deployed to deal with a counterfeit bill? Why was armed police deployed? So those are the kind of questions we have to ask. And I think that this personal, cultural, structural lens helps us to understand where we need to begin in terms of really building racial empowerment and linking these seemingly disparate areas.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for all that, Chenjerai. I think you hit on some really important things that I hope we can revisit and step through. So one, what I'm hearing is, right, this idea of paying attention and what we are choosing to focus on in a particular situation, right? And the level at which we're thinking about it, that we're asking questions is really critical. And understanding how all the parts and pieces fit together, right? So that's one thing I'm hearing. I really think this point you bring up about what is the revolutionary act? What does revolution even mean, right? I think is an important piece of this conversation as well. Do we really want revolution? And when I say we, it's important, I think, to say, who are we talking about, right? Do we as a society, as public, want it? Do corporations want it, right? I mean, this point you make about the performative activism, or what we see this performing by different actors, I think is really important. And I want us to sort of draw out some contemporary examples where we see that and really sort of interrogate that. And then there's this really critical piece that I think is often missing in the public discourse. But that's how, it's something that connects all of us here, which is like, where is labor in this, right? And who is labor, and how we think about it. And so with that, I actually want to bring in Todd into the discussion, to really sort of building on Chenjerai's comments, to like ground us also in this piece about how we think about labor, who is labor, right? Even my comment to say that, like, we, as a society, we're not really talking about it. We have been talking about police unions, right? Are police unions labor? Is that who we see? And so, yeah, Todd, why don't you like join us in the discussion? Love to hear from you on this.
Thank you, Fila. And I just want, I mean, I'm getting in late, but I just want to say how much I appreciate both the Rutgers Foundation for putting this on and getting to be with both of you on this critical issue. And I just want to maybe start by saying how much I appreciate some of the points Chenjerai said, and I'll use that to pivot us to a discussion of how labor intersects with questions of racial justice. So, I mean, one is this question of slow thinking. In this moment, in this world where everything is accelerated, and we're accelerated at a pace that makes it so hard to step back and deal with the thorny issues that actually dominate how we live together. And so you could just think we're a media studies program, the cable news cycle, and how it presses us towards a different way of engaging questions that makes it very hard to deal with these underlying core questions about racial justice in America. And then the other thing I just really want to underline is Chenjerai's call for us to be able to see these different, I think, layers from the personal to the cultural to the structural, and not to get fooled by thinking that one stands in for the other. All of these play a role in understanding the complex dynamics of racism, of inequality, et cetera. And so, and I also thought, I also just wanted to mark, as Chenjerai was talking about the revolutionary tradition and brought in Rutgers, that we can't forget people like Paul Robeson, right? Who is and very much carries a revolutionary tradition, as a Renaissance man who was amazing at everything he did, but also always stood for a righteous revolutionary vision of a world where everyone is equal. But to labor is also part of that tradition of the revolutionary tradition, but it's a contradiction. Like all human things, there is some beauty in the history of labor, and then there is some deep-rooted pain. And if we're going to think through the intersection of racial justice and labor today, we can't turn away from the pain in order to think through how to move forward. We have to actually engage the question of the rooted pain of our history there in order to figure out what is a tradition of liberation for all of us, right? And so to me, and the pain of that history, and Phila, you said this in a discussion we had previous, and it's so true, is often we think about the labor movement and history of racism in the labor movement, but we don't think about the history of labor in this country. And the history of labor in this country, right from its jump, is rooted in slavery, right? It's rooted in free labor in the South, right? That the country built itself up and off of. And so we often think about what are the problems with labor, but we can't actually think about labor without understanding that the very foundations of work, the very foundations of our life together were rooted in a system of slavery and extraction. And it's not only just the history of slavery in and of itself. In 1935, we passed the most important, I think flawed, but most important act or legislation around labor. This country, it dominates, National Labor Relations Act. And the NLRA, in its very core, calls for racialized exclusions, right? And so they built it out and said, workers have a right to basic human and rights, except for farm workers and domestic workers. Why farm workers and domestic workers in this act that still runs our labor regime today? Because of the roots of slavery and the agricultural South, right? So domestic workers and farm workers from the beginning of our current labor regime were excluded from all of the rights and protections. And so when we think of the history of racism and labor, we have to think about the very roots of how we understand work and who is excluded and included in the basic provisions of work. But it's not just there. We also have to look at the House of Labor itself. So Richard Trumka, who's now the president of the AFL-CIO, which is the umbrella body for almost all, but not all of the labor unions in this country, in 2015, not very long ago, acknowledged the deep history of racism inside the labor movement itself and called for what he called a labor commission on racial and economic justice. He did it in 2015. He did it shortly after the uprising in Ferguson and after Michael Brown's murder. And in that commission, they looked very closely at the history of labor and race. And you see all of these punctuated moments. So for instance, staying in St. Louis, a moment when there were black strike breakers brought in and white workers attacked those black strike breakers in St. Louis in 1917, right? And so this race was a point of conflict among workers all the way back there, right? But then we can even move forward. You think about our auto industry and the Henry Ford calling people to the North with better pay and what we would call part of the Great Migration, where Blacks left the South and moved to the North and throughout the West. So Henry Ford and the auto industry was a big part of that. But when he set up his factories, right, it was based on racialized exclusions, right? So black workers were working the hard jobs in the smelt, and white workers had other jobs, and they were in that they were separated. There was tensions within them, and it wasn't just the company, it wasn't just Ford or Chrysler, it was also the union itself. So the union became a mirror, United Auto Workers became a mirror of the racist kind of practices of the auto industry. And so famous organizers from Detroit, a guy who I look to named General Baker, would argue that when they were trying to fight for basic rights as workers, they had to both fight the boss they also had to fight the leaders of the union. Ultimately, they were able to integrate that, and it led to some of the UAW locals were some of the strongest unions in this country because of the power of their integration. So, and I think when we think about a revolutionary tradition, we're thinking about a tradition that does deeply enmesh workers across race in a shared vision, but not a vision that favors one over the other, but actually is rooted in the most vulnerable. So I think that's a history we have to come to terms with if we're going to try to think about what a revolutionary tradition might look like across labor and racial justice.
Yeah, so I think I want to just sort of pull some things together here, because what we're talking about is, at least how I'm thinking about it is, as we look at these incidents, right? Incidents is sort of maybe not the right term, but or even crises moments, right? It's important. I hear to what on the one hand that we're thinking about the level of analysis and how we're problematizing, right? Like, what is the problem? And I'm hearing that the thinking about the structural aspects, right, is just as critical and perhaps more than like thinking about culture and personal, or maybe thinking about all of those levels and how they're connected. What I'm also hearing is actually that labor is always in the story, right? It's really about who is labor and how we're thinking about it, but it's there, right? I made the comment earlier that, like, you know, my work looks at, people talk about the future of work. I prefer the future of workers. And it's because labor is always in the story, right? It was in the George Floyd story. You know, there's definitely like a class piece here too that's important. He wasn't just a Black man, right? His socioeconomic situation, the structural position he found himself in, one might argue made him more susceptible. So I do think it's important to bring in this notion of not just race when we're thinking about the problems, racism, right? We're also thinking about class as well and how they interact. So what I'm hearing from both of you is, right, like, how do we get one, in order to really move forward, right, it's about getting a full picture and about what we're pulling into the picture. So, you know, and I think the history is important here, right, is to say, as we're thinking about the history, as we're thinking about the structure, as we're thinking about labor, right, this root in systemic racism is there. It's just, you sort of pulled us through all these examples, Todd. So I kind of want to pull us through even more to like this present day and thinking about the contemporary context and thinking about what we're seeing in organizing, what we're seeing in, again, we mentioned the role of corporations and this fight for racial justice that it seems like all of us seem to be in, although I want to like engage you all because I'm interested in whether you think we're all in it. Right, we see Uber, Lyft, Amazon, right? I focus on some of the big ones, but it's a systemic issue, right? We see them like fighting or talking about racial justice, I should say. And so I know you have thoughts on this, Chenjerai, about like whether that is really what they're doing. And so, yeah, can we bring it to the contemporary and talk about how we see some of these dynamics playing out?
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of problems hearing you on your end, but I think that I mean on my end. But did you just kick it off to me, Phila?
I did. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm interested to open this up to the audience because I'm just so glad that you all took the time here. But I will say a couple of brief notes I just want to pick up on. You know, as we mentioned, I mean, one thing I really want to be clear on is, one of the things that's so exciting about having this conversation at Rutgers is that our union has, I think, one of the most cutting edge ways of responding to these sort of intersecting situations and conditions of what I'm going to call oppression that create this moment. So we are very much also in touch with and doing research on, through something we have called the MIC Center, the Media Inequality and Change Center, the the other people, other folks who are in this movement who've begun to understand this intersection between racial empowerment, things like policing, and also labor, right? Both working in the gig economy, both working in companies like, some of the movements to try to create more democracy and equality at Amazon, and many others. So we have so many of the solutions here. So although this sounds like we could be just pointing out like this history of struggle where everyone loses, this is actually, for me, an inspirational kind of conversation, because it points us to not so much to like, are we going to find a solution, or are we just going to keep complaining? That sort of false binary, as though complaining doesn't lead to to solutions, but also into more to like a different kind of framework, which is like, what kinds of solutions are being offered to us that don't really hit the mark versus the ones that do. And I mean, Fila has done great research on and great inquiry on looking at, how a company like Amazon, who literally is depriving its workers of the most basic health rights, and in many plants, a disproportionately Black and brown workforce, right? How do we then use this kind of personal cultural structural model to say, sure, Amazon has put up, a sign saying Black Lives Matter. Amazon sort of might even be having some trainings, where it's like management is meant to read white fragility or something like that. I mean, I don't think they're actually even doing that, but if maybe they are, and then they're going to throw like minute amounts of money that may or may not actually get to the community. But somehow we're not looking at the strategy, the organizing in Bessemer, or the organizers in Amazon on the West Coast, who have said, we don't want to continue to make surveillance technologies, right? Or the people in DCH1 in Chicago, or what's going on in Staten Island right now, led by people like Jordan Flowers and all those kind of Christopher Smalls. Like, those things don't come into the conversation about racial empowerment in the way that they need to. And it's only by looking at those that we then understand the criteria, where we say, okay, Amazon, if we want to be generous to Amazon, which, why be generous to one of the most richest companies in the world? But if we want to be generous to them, and that's our concern, it's like, yes, we can invite you into the struggle here, but the criteria are, you must address your own labor conditions. You know what I'm saying? And we know that the only way to really do that is to negotiate and bargain with your workers. I just want to say quickly, in the context of Rutgers, and we can talk more about this, people often ask me, they'll say, Chenjerai, don't you think Rutgers is making like all this tremendous progress on race? Isn't it such a racially progressive institution? And, I'm excited about having, like a president who understands a little bit of the history of Black, struggle. I'm excited about having so many colleagues who get it, and who can bring research, right? Systematic research to these questions. But the criteria isn't simply the presence of those people. Because if we are going to lay off thousands of workers who are predominantly Black and white, predominantly multiracial, but predominantly Black and brown. And if we're going to, extend Rutgers such that the Lincoln Annex, a Latino school in our community, has to be shut down. If we're going to not give women pay equity, we cannot do those things and then put me on some brochures and say we care about our race as a university. Okay, I don't care what reason someone wants to give you. If thousands of workers are being, their jobs threatened, don't have the conditions, then we as a university have to step up in a different way. And that's not about a cynical critique. That's about what the substance of racial empowerment actually looks like. I know I sound passionate, but y'all gonna have to listen to me because I'm a professor in your university. You know what I'm saying? And this is George Floyd's anniversary, and we got to get real about this. So I want to invite y'all in, but I just wanted to kind of mark those differences.
Yeah. I mean, Todd, if you have anything, and we do have a question that I'll get to in a sec, but like, just, for me, what was what really pissed me off, right, over the last year has really been seeing companies talk about Black Lives Matter, and then I'm saying, if they matter, then why isn't your predominantly Black or of color workforce making a living wage, right? There was just an article we saw come out in Forbes recently that looked at all the companies who sort of have been investing in racial justice and diversity, but showing that the indicators of what we would seemingly see, like the racial gap wealth gap being closed, or disparities, right? Like, they're still there, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think this point is really critical. Like, if lives really do matter, then how are we treating them, right? On a broader level, what are their living conditions? Todd, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to pick up on that, but also just acknowledge the work that both of you have done on this front, which is, it means a lot. But so I've been doing research on Uber and Lyft, which connects to some of the points you're making. And if you go to the parking lot in Philadelphia, where most Uber and Lyft drivers get their rides, the majority of the full-time drivers get their work out of the Philadelphia airport. And I've gone there and I've researched, I've interviewed about 100 Uber and Lyft drivers. What you find is 80% of those drivers are people of color, largely immigrants, right? Uber, like any number of these companies, will on one hand extol the virtues of Black Lives Matter, right? Or talk about free rides to the polls for people of color, etc. But in the same moment, they are banking on the fact that most of the people in their workforce are immigrants and some are in the shadows for X, Y, and Z reason, or less protected. And they are banking on that in order to exclude them from basic human rights. Or they make an argument that they have a part-time workforce. Yeah, about 40 to 50% of their drivers are part-time, but 80 to 90% of the trips that Uber does are the full-timers who are largely people of color, and they can't make a living wage, right? And so Uber and Lyft have a racialized project, and they trade off that racialized project of excluding and hurting their own workers by saying that they care about these issues. And it's really, it's awful to watch, you know, and I think it's not just them, though. If you look at, again, I want us to think about the House of Labor for a minute. Who is organized in this country today? Who does labor organize and represent, and who do they not represent? They don't represent low-wage workers, largely women and people of color, for the most part, as often as they do some of the more blue-collar sectors. They have absolutely ignored gig workers, right? So there's a real question about who labor works to organize. And last point I want to make, and I know we want to get to Q&A, it picks up on what Chenjerai is arguing, which is there is a tradition, right? Yes, here at Rutgers, we're trying, the union is trying to reimagine that tradition, but we're standing on the shoulders of others. So I just want to take, for instance, the Chicago Teachers Union, right? Just for a minute to talk about how we can organize ourselves to make these changes. So that's teachers. I don't know, 30,000 teachers, more probably, in Chicago. And the core demand in their last contract fight was not about a raise or benefits. It was about more teachers in the classroom, less students per class, and it was about housing counselors for students, because they estimated that some 50 to 100,000 students in the Chicago school district were homeless. Right. And so their core demand at the bargaining table as a union was looking after their students who are largely people of color, largely African-American. Right. And so for our unions moving forward, in Rutgers, we're looking very closely at this. We have to do the same. We have to have the same sort of strategy, which is where we have our most power is in collective bargaining. But when we collectively bargain, we can't just be talking about our raises and our benefits. We have to talk about the communities where we work. Rutgers is in 3 minority cities: Newark, New Brunswick, Camden. And we have to take up the fights of the residents in those communities as our own if we're going to reimagine the labor movement.
Yeah, I want to jump into Q&A, just building on this. We've had a couple questions come in. I'm going to sort of work backwards, actually, because the last questions I think seems to fit into what we're talking about. And it's building on this idea of companies saying one thing in their statements, but then, you know, in terms of their actual practices, right, or the culture or the system that they're producing or reproducing, it's completely the opposite or contradictory. So one of the questions someone made is, do you think it's better that companies just not make the statements altogether, especially if it means nothing to them, but publicity and conditionals? Yeah, so that's the question.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this question briefly. Let me just say that, you know, this particular tradition of not all efforts of diversity and inclusion, but the ones that emanate and are being practiced widely in the corporate sector come out of a public relations tradition. So what they're actually looking at is not how do we meaningfully contribute to a sense of racial empowerment, labor empowerment, but actually how do we, you know, make our brand be something that is more friendly to people that we need to work with, to a variety of sort of shareholders primarily, and maybe other loosely affiliated stakeholders, but not the stakeholders inside the company. So I think it's a great question. But I think a better question is, what is required of us in terms of, you know, causing these companies when they make these statements, because they're going to continue to do it, to sort of say, well, but to sort of link the conditions in the company to those statements, right? And force them to reckon with that critically. I mean, that's the critical project, right? So, I mean, I recognize this question, but I just want to also point to, and I know the person who's asking this question doesn't mean it this way, but often when people say, so what do you want the companies to do? Nothing. That's not actually often when it's posed. Here it is, but often that's not a really good faith question. It's meant to sort of say, here's a binary. They can do something, they can do nothing. Therefore, you have to be happy with what they did. We reject that, and I think we should all invite us all to reject that, and in fact to say no. If Amazon says they care about Black lives, then let's look. Then they have to address the conditions of the Black lives in their workforce. 19,000 of whom got COVID during a particular period where Amazon made billions of dollars.
I just want to take it really quickly. I know we want to get as many questions as we want, but I completely agree with Chenjerai here. I mean, if you think about the Amazon since the pandemic hit, Jeff Bezos's wealth, his own personal wealth, doubled by some 40 to 50 billion dollars, right, in the course of the greatest health crisis in the history of our country, right? And the question is not what should we ask Jeff Bezos and Amazon to do. The question is, what are the demands we make on him, not only for his workforce, but for all of us, right? That there's no humane society where in the middle of a great health crisis, the richest human in the world doubles their wealth. And while most people, and 1,000 workers, as Chenjerai said, at Rutgers are losing their job and losing their health care. So on one hand, we have a society where at Rutgers in of itself, 1,000 people are laid off and lose their health care. And on the other hand, we have Jeff Bezos doubling his wealth. That is a calculus or a logic we can't live by. And so we have to make more powerful demands on these companies. Sorry, jump in, Fila.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that those two different things, the wealth of Bezos and others, and the living conditions of others, it's not just these two things exist. The wealth of Jeff Bezos is a function of the living conditions of his workers. Like those things are, you know, connected. Someone's asking here, actually, let me give a couple questions just to make sure, and then you guys can sort of speak to both of them. So one question is, what's the most important thing that K-12 public administrators can do to support young people of all races in their schools? And how do we best integrate true images of history, as you guys have mentioned, in teaching and learning? And then another question is really about actionable steps to increase accountability, which I know we want to get to that anyway. Yeah, let's go with those two, and then hopefully we can circle back to the other couple of questions we have. You guys want to respond to those?
Yeah, I'll respond briefly and say thank you for this question. You know, I recently gave a talk to the Northwest Conference of Teachers and Social Justice that included from teachers around the world, and I do a lot of work with the Zen Education Project. I just want to say this intersection we're talking about around social justice empowerment across identities and oppressive systems, racial empowerment, issues of policing, you know, in some ways, the teachers there's a revolutionary tradition of teachers in this country that I think is really innovating and showing us the way. And by the way, just in case some people are uncomfortable with the term revolutionary, I mean, one way to think about this is to just think that what we mean is something that's truly transformative. You know, I know a lot of times revolutionary is scary. It sort of stands in as a sort of proxy for other words like impractical or violent or things like that. Let's be crystal clear. When I approach you as a Black male professor in this university, every right I'm exercising at this moment was fought for by people who were pushing back, breaking laws, pushing back against systems, organizing, thinking, writing in a critical revolutionary tradition. In other words, saying, having to imagine a society that is vastly different than the one that they were living in. You know, I mean, how impractical would it have seemed for an enslaved person the year before the Civil War to imagine that I would be in the situation I'm in right now, right? And that we would be, you know, so I just want to say that's why we use the term revolutionary tradition. It also helps us to clarify, you know, there have been some, you know, as Todd has said, unions are complex, and often people who are clearer on this idea of fighting for the common good have had to fight to get power within their unions, right? And you see that with the teachers union strike. So I would say with the administrators, look to that tradition, governance by teachers who understand the conditions that they're working with as like as a key guide. One other thing I would say is there's a wealth of materials and curriculum out there. There's a movement called Black Lives Matter in Schools, the Zen Education Project, Facing History in Ourselves. These are organizations that you can connect with. In other words, you're not on your own, who have thought out the curriculum. The problem is that if teachers are not empowered to teach what matters, to push back against some of these reactionary politics that pretend to be about balance and objectivity, then they won't have the power to integrate those curriculums. So I would say, for me, I'm big on teacher power and student power actually as well. And I'm happy to provide more resources for that for those that are interested.
I'll just say briefly, I completely agree. First of all, I love the question about what do K-12 administrators and teachers do, given the distorted history that we feed our students all the time. And so I just want to underline that what Chenjerai said here about the beautiful tradition of teachers, the radical tradition of teachers who in many ways in this country are leading the way in reimagining what is to be done for all of us. And so one, I want to say that there must be stuff there. And I think the Black Lives Matter curriculum that many teachers unions and teachers have kind of built out is something to look to. I think the other thing I wanted to just say, and this I would kick back to Fila, it brings me back to this question of who is a worker? What is the image of a worker that we've had? And so we were talking about this when we were prepping for this. The vision we have of who is a worker is this vision of this white guy with a hard hat on, right? Going to a construction site. And it's completely distorted our understanding of what work means today. And I really want to kick this back to you, Fila, because you've thought so much, you said such enlightening things about it. But to me, I think we have to help reimagine who are workers today? What's a care economy? Who is in the care economy? All these questions about what work is and who is working today have to be thought through and brought to our young people.
Yeah, I mean, I think this point, just circling a couple things, right? Like, first of all, like, where is labor, or who are the workers in all of these stories, right? They're always there, but we're just not looking at it, I think is an important piece. And this notion of like I mean, I think it begins with really valuing and seeing all labor as like dignified and important work, right? I mean, we saw a lot of this narrative with COVID about the essential worker and frontline workers. We also saw and learned that those were the workers that are paid the least, protected the least. They don't even necessarily fall under labor law or protections. They don't have rights to collectively bargain or any of these things, but yet we're calling them essential workers. And for me, that means they're essential to our economy running, right? But they're not essential enough for us to treat them the way they should be treating, which I think gets to this core inherent contradiction that our country, right, was even built on, right? Is that the work, the labor, right, the slave labor, for example, that built this country, we didn't see it as even human or dignified labor. And so I think seeing that story repeated over and over again, even in a contemporary context, is a critical reckoning and something we need to confront. And we need to link it to how we think about what accountability really means, which gets to another question someone has asked, which is, this idea of Amazon presumably saying they're for Black Lives Matter and then viciously opposing unionization, not just in Bessemer, where we saw this recent election, but just other places. And it's not just Amazon. I know we're picking on some of these companies, and I think it's important to note that this is a broader systemic challenge and not just Amazon or Uber or Lyft or even in the tech sector. So do you guys want to actually comment maybe on that piece about just like this idea of these companies being about this and versus unionizing, which I think we touched on, but I also wanted to bring in this other question someone said, because I think it relates to this point you make, Chenjerai, about what the revolutionary action is and what revolution is, which is that someone is asking, you know, they're commenting on your point about reform and how we respond to certain social issues, and that it shouldn't always be about the police. And so they're asking, like, who and what would have been an accurate responder to what happened with George Floyd.
Absolutely.
But I think
Yeah.
this point about reform and revolution is like a really important tension that's here.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Phila. I just want to say that, you know, one of the things we talked about in terms of, you know, thinking about policing in this country, and I want to bring this back to labor, I mean, is that one of the assumptions people make, I understand why people believe in police so much, and that's because we know that there's real harm that happens in our society, right? And we figure like, well, you know, and we know that actually that some of the most vulnerable people experience most of that harm, right? So in that context, you know, it could have seemed illogical to want to talk about peeling back police or thinking about other things. But the key assumption that people make that is debunked by historical research, which is great to be at a university of Rutgers, is that police were created actually to protect the most vulnerable from harm. That's an assumption that is not borne out by history and that is definitively debunked by any study of policing in America. Policing arose in America as a labor repression mechanism that, as Todd pointed to, right? The reason why policing actually starts as a formalized institution in the United States before any other place in the world, before Europe, is because of the unique conditions where, you know, people needed, you know, the needs for slave patrols, right? Labor running away off the exercising their resistance in the form of leaving the plantation at first, and then in terms of plotting rebellion. So it's the specific nature of police in our country starts from that vantage point, expands to other labor contexts, right? Including that of Amazon, right? Because what we see with Amazon is that their union efforts, I mean, in Bessemer, we see them, you know, inside having campaigns against, you know, the union thing. We see them, you know, just opposing the union, putting millions of dollars into PR, but actually across the ocean, right? If you look at Poland, if you look at Spain, what we see is Amazon working with police to suppress strikes, right? To infiltrate labor unions, right? So policing, once again, becomes the mechanism of labor repression, right? And so I think that to answer this question, once you actually say what actually will lead to harm being reduced, your imagination just opens up. Okay, someone hands somebody a counterfeit bill. First of all, why? Because they're trying to buy food? This is a person who needs food, right? We all of a sudden care work, right? You talk about essential work, the possibility for care opens up. That's a social problem that needs to be addressed. This person has lost their job. They're trying to heal from substance abuse. You can see the agencies that can come in that that really are like, our imagination can't get to that because all we can think of is this armed person, even for the business who might be hurt by the counterfeit bill. When you have a counterfeit bill, what you want to do is trace it and figuring out who's making this fake money, right? Okay, do you need an armed police officer with 6 weeks of training, mainly about repressing people, to solve that problem? No. So now you actually, what you did was you brought police in. That didn't help the business at all, and it killed George Floyd. Okay, so the imagination opens up when you ask that question. It's like, oh, you know, you mean to tell me you have a private company putting satellites in the air, you know, all these things, right? But we can't figure out how to deal with counterfeit without actually like killing people? No, it's not. It shows that we haven't asked this question seriously.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really good. But we have like a couple minutes left, and this question, it's not just for Todd, but given that you're president of the Rutgers Union, you may want to respond to this. And then maybe some final like just quick things from you guys. So this last question is, my university is predominantly white and we don't have a formalized union for faculty. Do you feel that the very few BIPOC members should fight for a union? This person thinks it would help with retention and recruitment efforts, but they want to hear what you have to say on that. Yeah.
And the short answer is yes, of course. A union, any union, is going to be a reflection of the people who are the most engaged with it, right? And so our union has, you know, really fought on issues of diversity, inclusion, equal pay for equal work, right? And so in our last contract, in fact, we won, and we're still working on it, but we won a process for women and people of color to show that their male and white counterparts who are making more get an adjustment in their salary for faculty. That should actually happen for all the people who are all 30,000 workers at this university. But so far we've won it for the faculty at the university. And we also won a $20 million fund to hire and retain people of color, because New Jersey is an extremely diverse state, much more diverse than the faculty, right? So faculty here are, I think it's 7, 8, or 9% African American and 5 or 6% Latinx, which does not in any way come close to the numbers and proportion of Black and Latino people in the state. So the union has taken it on itself to lead there. And so in any number of ways, a union can make critical interventions, not only on your pay, and everybody who's union makes more than everybody who's not union in almost every sector. So it would help in the bread and butter issues, but also in some of the core issues that many unions don't fight on. So the answer is yes, yes, yes. And Rutgers AUP AFT is here to help you. So reach out if you want to help.
So with that, I think that's a really great note to end on. Thank you so much to everyone who joined today. Thank you again to the Rutgers Alumni Association in this virtual series. Thank you, of course, to Chenjerai and Todd for, I hope, everyone would say this was a great conversation. And I think with that, thank you.
Could I just jump in real quick? Because
yeah.
I just thank you, Philip, for that. And I just want to thank everybody who was on this call from the bottom of my heart. We get the temperature up here because we're dealing with people's lives, but I just want to thank you. I want you to know that the tradition we're working in is a unifying tradition. It brings together people across identities against all the forces of hate that are out there. And we have a lot of practical solutions. And so I know we can't cover all of that in this call, but I encourage you to reach out to us. We can provide you with the podcast. I got y'all on the podcast. We can provide you on the research materials, and we can connect you to the organizations, and we want your solutions. So I just want to send that love energy out right now in these challenging times. Thank you so much for having us.
I'll double down. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rutgers Alumni Foundation. Thank you, Phila, so much. Chenjerai and Phila, it's such an honor to be on, and thanks to the audience.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you, guys.